So the next film we're going to review is System Crasher, which is set for a March 27th release. Of course, all of that is, very much up in the air and pending, but that's what it's currently slated for right now. It's been on the festival circuit for a while. I first became aware of it at Cambridge Film Festival in 2019, but I believe it made its debut at Berlinale in 2019. So the people who've seen this are myself and Betty. Betty, why don't you just bring us into the film and give us a little bit of an idea what it's about?
So, Nora Fingscheid's drama film follows a troubled 9-year-old girl called Benny, who displays all kinds of erratic and violent behavior, which makes her extremely difficult for any foster family or child welfare home to handle. Individuals, whether children or adults, who have a difficult or impossible time integrating into these support systems are commonly referred to as system crashers, where the title of the film comes from. We see Benny get attached to her school escort, Micha, who's played by Albrecht Schuh. He's a former ruffian turned anger management therapist, and he tries to mitigate her behavioral issues by methods such as taking her to the woods and working with her one-on-one in general. The film depicts a whole series of attempts made by social workers, Benny's mother, Micha, and all other people close to her, to help her lead a relatively normal life, all with varying degrees of success.
Yeah, and the cast, so we basically follow Benny, so the young girl who's basically rejected Bernadette as her name. She prefers to be called Benny. It's played by Helena Zengel, and I've got to say, I think it's a really terrific central performance for her. We'll get on to the other aspects of the film shortly, because there's a couple of things that I think could be questioned, but overall I think this is a really effective film. I think it's a very engaging and really quite difficult to watch film. There's quite a lot of segments and sequences which really have you wincing and really kind of like, worrying for this girl and also the people around her who are affected by her behaviour. What did you think of that performance? Because obviously there's a few performances the film hinges on. I think that is the key one, though.
Helena Zenkel's performance, I think, is one of the most impressive child performances that I've seen in recent years in general. I think it achieves something pretty unique in the sense that, like, most films require you to suspend disbelief, whereas with this one, I would often have to remind myself not to believe it. As far as I know, Nora Fingscheid's film background is in documentary, actually, which makes sense that she'd have the knack to direct her in this way. Not to take away from, like, her obvious talent in acting as such. I also thought Albrecht Schuh gave a very good performance here as well, and I think their dynamic functioned very, very well, especially with the central actress's extremely genuine, extremely charming as well performance, in the sense that, like, she is ultimately playing an extremely complex character that you have to both fear and sympathize with simultaneously.
Yeah, and I'd very much agree with that. I think the central performance is excellent, and I think that thing you mentioned about a combination of, sympathising and empathising with the Benny character, but also being quite afraid of her, which, she's a small 9-year-old child. It's quite, it feels, if you've not seen the film, it feels like an odd thing to say, but you really do worry about the consequences of the behaviour that she accelerates into, I would say, because as you said, like, frequently it's a very charming performance and she's like this very sweet 9-year-old kid, but then she does have some behavioural issues and they are triggered in various different ways. I think the one in the film that focuses on the most with its formal aspects is when her face is touched, and it does a great job of building up a sense of, I don't want to say dread because that makes it sound grander than it is, but it's a real kind of like apprehension about what is going to happen next. And I think the film does that extremely well. And that is a combination of that central performance from Helena Zengel, but also the actual construction of the film and the way it's been edited as well, and the way that Nora Fingscheid has constructed that. In particular, when Benny is set off particularly by, having something touch her face or something like that, it will quickly go into kind of like an almost literal, the red mist descends, really. Although in this case, like with the use of colour in this film, like pink is the thing. And if you've seen the trailers or stills for the film, like Benny wears this very distinctive like pink jacket. So in this case, it's more of the pink mist, and that keeps that kind of that colour theme going. But basically, that immediately descends, and there's a lot of rapid cuts, and kind of you obviously get this idea of this rush and loss of control that obviously the young girl's feeling, and I think it gets that across very well. Is it the most subtle way of doing it? No, but it is extremely effective, and it builds up this kind of dread about when that's going to happen, because there's no warning it is going to happen. There's not really a build-up. It is a very sudden trigger. And I think the film does that extremely well. I think it needed the figure of Misha, played by Albrashu, to balance that out, because I think seeing an adult bounce off that performance also brings a completely different layer to it as they try to understand it. What would you say beyond the performances stood out to you? Because obviously I've spoken about the editing and kind of that construction of it, but what else do you think that brought to the film, if anything?
I think the film is also structured rather episodically, in a way, in the sense that each segment of the film follows what almost I think can be distilled into a formula, which is, number one, Benny acts out in a minor fashion, so you can tell that she's a problem child one way or another, but it's usually not something completely extreme. It's usually her being rude, or pushing around other kids. But then some steps are taken to help her in one way or another, or you could at least see other characters trying to think of a plan to help her, like a long-term plan. And then number three, she seems to respond positively to whatever new method has been tried, especially with Shu's character, where he takes her to the woods and tries to focus a bit more on her specifically. She obviously reacts quite positively to that and seems to benefit from this. But then, step 4, she circles back to not letting the others control her and acts out in a major way. So she does something exceptionally violent. Say she bludgeons a child, or otherwise does something that...
Which, to give you an idea of this film, that's not a spoiler, because more than one child gets bludgeoned during this film. So just anybody thinking we're giving something away there, if you see that happen in the film, spoiler alert, it's not going to be the last time.
You got to see this sort of like major kind of acting out happen several times, and there's so many different creative ways in which she can create this horrifying and scary situation. This structure may at some points be a little bit repetitive, but one thing it does achieve is that after a while, you know exactly what's coming, but also you can't anticipate the extent to which this new breakdown will endanger the other characters or Benny herself. So the film does a good job of letting you sort of simmer in this anxious anticipation of something going terribly, terribly wrong. And I think it only manages to achieve that by sort of... it only manages to achieve that by sort of engaging in this weird filmic Pavlovian conditioning, where you know exactly when the tone slightly shifts and when Benny is about to start acting out.
Yeah, I think you've got exactly right there, and the different little bits, like the structure repeats, but then if you look at it across the whole of the film, it does ramp up as it goes, and it becomes different scenarios, some of which are a lot more kind of difficult to watch and deal with, I would say. One thing that I do think is quite interesting about the film is, so we've only really mentioned two characters here, so Benny and her school escort, Misha, who has to take her to school each day. There are a bunch of other peripheral characters for the most part. I would say the most significant from a narrative standpoint is probably Benny's mother. that would be a chief one. Then there are also the people in charge of the various care homes that she bounces between, because there's an emergency shelter, but then there are actually other permanent homes that she's in it for very short periods in the film, because of course that's the entire point, that she doesn't fit into this system. What I think is quite good about it is I think the film manages to toe that line of not really passing judgment on anyone. I think there's definitely people who come out of it better. So there's a character, Mrs. Bafani, who is clearly in charge of the placing of Benny, and she comes out of it very well. But you can see there's really a real strain on her to deal with it. And, she comes out better, I would say, than Benny's mother does. But everybody is presented quite sympathetically. And if you think about that the old Roger Ebert quote about, cinema being a machine for generating empathy, this film in a strange way is actually quite a good way of showing that. I think you do have empathy for just about anybody who is on screen. Maybe not necessarily the way they deal with any one thing, but I think the film toes that line quite well. I think we've been quite positive about the film. I'm not going to say nitpick, because I don't think it is, but the one drawback I will say is it doesn't quite hit its tone all the time, I don't think. And that's not to do with it going between moments where it's uplifting for Benny and then, she's triggered in some fashion and, has one of the many incidents that cause kind of such exasperation for the people trying to care for her. It's more when it goes between vaguely comedic and cute, I would say, and what is slightly more troubling behaviour. I don't think it blends that as well as it could at points. I think it gets away with it, and I think the performances and the construction of the film are that good that it doesn't necessarily take away from it. But in particular, without giving away what happens, I think we were talking about the ending. The ending kind of summarises for me that weird jarring of tones. And there is a little bit... and unfortunately, I don't really have experience of this arena myself, but the construction of the story is a little bit kind of, with more attention and love, massive behavioural problems can be fixed, right? And I get the idea is that, individuals don't fit into this system, and it doesn't suit all of them. And that's absolutely correct, and I think it dramatises that extremely well. It does skirt a little close at times, I think, to maybe proposing something which doesn't really work across everyone. In looking for an individual solution, I think it maybe neglects to look at how effective what it's maybe hinting at would go for. That's my only real problem with the film, but I would be lying if I said you really notice that during the runtime for me.
I think what you cited as the main problem of the film is sort of a consequence of it not really knowing whether it wants to go with a kind of heartwarming liberation narrative, or rather going with the fact that sometimes these situations are genuinely hopeless, and to also use the fact that all of the characters, in one way or another, have something redeeming about them. And the very fact that you can have at least a modicum of empathy for everybody means that nobody is actually directly responsible for what is happening to Benny. Especially not like Benny herself, who, even though she does all of these extremely violent and dangerous things, especially to other people, in spite of that, you know that she is basically just a problem child and that she can't actually be blamed for whatever is happening. We, as far as I know, don't have much access to whatever trauma she experienced in early childhood, but we can't... The fact that we can't know means that we can only assume that whatever Benny is doing was maybe the fault of someone else, but then we can't know that for sure either. So the film, in being charitable to almost everybody in it, like all of the characters in the film being portrayed in ways that avoid demonizing them in any way, the film is all the more hopeless because of that, because you know that this is a situation that is ultimately beyond everybody's control, which is why this sort of idea that, with enough patience and affection, this problem could be solved, could never really work in this film. And especially not the idea that what we actually need is to give Benny more freedom to be a kid or whatever. Because there's so many montages in this film of her like sort of running around and being playful with a lot of this like zany music playing, that sort of works against that initial idea, which is that, well, in fact, not much actually can be done. At least not with the structural problems that the child welfare system is experiencing on a level that's much broader than any individual actor within it. This is a problem that I've also noticed with the film, and that also occasionally did not completely take me out of it, but did make me wonder whether there was some kind of dissonance between the people making it about what kind of tone they ultimately wanted to settle with in relation to whether this is ultimately bleak, or if we can pepper in some moments of cutesy dance music.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment to make, and I think if anybody sees this film, I don't think either of us are saying that it's, completely jarring and it suddenly turns into like, Little Miss Sunshine in the middle of it being, like The Omen or something like that. That's not what happens. It's more just, as you say, that kind of like slightly bleaker, lack of resolution story that's going. There are moments that just sit a little aside from it, and I don't think the film does them perfectly. I wouldn't say it necessarily does them badly as such, but it's a tone that isn't quite blended correct, and I understand why it's there. So Nora Finchite was the director. She also wrote it. As far as I'm aware, it's the first narrative feature, certainly directing. And I get the feeling it's probably in there to remind us that, Benny is a kid. She's not Damien from The Omen. She's a kid, right? A kid with some big issues, but that's what she is, and I think that's why it's there. I'm not convinced that they blend that particularly well, because there are moments where I think it is done quite well. There's one quite nice scene where she's been walked to school by Misha, and like she's peppering with questions. What's your favorite color? What's this? And like these ridiculous questions that like only like kids would like consider like so important and have to be answered in such quick succession. But that retains the more naturalistic feel of the other parts, right? Because when she starts acting out and has these violent episodes, it is dealt with in a very real fashion, right? Handheld camera, it's quite muted, and it fits in with that. Some of these segments where, as you said, the music maybe goes a bit zany and like some montage of her doing stuff, that maybe sits apart from it. So I see why it's there, but for me, it just didn't quite sit with the rest of the film. So I think we'd both recommend that. Just some small issues, but overall it's a very good film, very good central performance, very good supporting performances, and certainly the construction and the editing of the film really lend a lot to it. And I think we'd both recommend it and check that out.